anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me.
All right, guys, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. We are now officially in double digits. I'm very excited about that, and of course, all of the support that you guys have given me listening to my show every week for the last 10 weeks. I really appreciate it, and you guys are the ones that make this possible. Today, we are finally going to come around to talking about COVID, and I've been talking about it for a while and kind of dancing around the issue, but I felt like at this point in the podcast, we need to address it. But we're not going to focus on COVID particularly. Instead, we're going to talk about science more generally, because one of the main themes on this show is the idea that people use all of these terms that they never actually define. And science is one of those words that is thrown around by everybody, especially in public, especially during the pandemic. But very few people stop to actually define what that term means. But the word science caused a ton of damage over the last 2 years. And I have a feeling that if you're like me and you're listening to a podcast called the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, you were uncomfortable, to say the least, with some of the government overreaches that took place because of the COVID pandemic, or in the name of the COVID pandemic. And science was the key category that justified that massive, massive government grab of power and all of the hysterical social reactions that took place during the COVID pandemic, and yet no one ever stopped to actually try to define it. It was really quite maddening. Like, the entire time the pandemic went on, we were told by several people that we had to believe the science and that we needed to trust the scientists, but no one ever stopped to try to think about what that actually meant. Never mind the fact that there were plenty of scientists that were giving alternate explanations both for what caused COVID, what COVID could do to you if you caught it, and how we should treat it. There were a lot of people that were not in agreement within the scientific community with the mainstream narrative, but nevertheless, those people were silenced in the name of science. And why was that? So Anthony Fauci, of course, and we heard from him in the introduction today, he claimed that he represents the science, like he, as a government bureaucrat, represented the scientific consensus on COVID. And yet, the NIAID, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention have promoted plenty of anti-COVID measures that were not based on either hard scientific research or statistics. And again, if you're listening to this isn't going to be a surprise to you, but how many times during the pandemic were the NIAID, the CDC, and other government spokespeople not just wrong, but how many times did they flat out lie to us during the pandemic about how to effectively stop the spread of the disease, where it came from? I mean, just over and over and over again during the pandemic, we got fed this line that the science supported this massive government overreach and intervention in our lives. And we've seen the results of that. It destroyed millions and millions of lives around the United States, only for the CDC to finally come around and say that a lot of the positions that those of us in the libertarian movement were skeptical about all along were actually true. Like, for instance, cloth masks don't actually stop the spread of COVID-19. I'm glad the CDC corrected themselves on that, but it's too little too late. All of it was done in the name of science, and yet no one ever defined what science meant or thought about how science actually worked. It's also been perceived, and this is where the Protestant part of this show is really going to kick in today, it's been perceived from the Enlightenment on, the science has been perceived, that is, from the Enlightenment on, to be the main competitor to religion, as if science and religion are competing to dominate a single domain of knowledge, as if you can't believe in God and also believe in science as well. And again, for the last 300 years, that has been kind of the cornerstone of a lot of conversations about science in Western culture, that we have science now, and science has somehow superseded religion. And in their turn, Christians have often responded by flat out denying some of the findings of science. And so you have these people that support science and these people that support religion, and they flat out argue with each other all the time. They say that either science or religion has to explain the whole of reality, and we're forced to make a choice between one of those two. You have to have either one or the other. And so people that are skeptical of religion are often going to side with the science, and people that are skeptical of the science are often going to side with religion, as if those two are mutually contradictory. And so just like its political use, the term science, when we invoke it in terms of its competing sphere of intellectual influence with religion, is often invoked and yet never defined. People always throw around the word science, but they mean a bunch of different things about it. So the goal of the podcast today, what we're going to be trying to uncover or go through today, is to offer an explanation of how science actually works, and then we are going to provide a definition of science that will allow us to think more clearly about both the political and the theological appropriations of that term. In order to do this, we are going to take a look at Thomas Kuhn's classic work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is a philosophy of science that a scientist, Thomas Kuhn, wrote in 1962, but it's been incredibly influential, especially among kind of postmodernist philosophical types of thinkers. And Thomas Kuhn's burden in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is to understand how scientific revolutions take place and the effects that scientific revolutions have on subsequent scientific research. So the goal of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is to try to explain how science develops or progresses. And the most important contention that Kuhn makes in the book is that scientists operate within paradigms. And a paradigm, Thomas Kuhn defines as a universally recognized scientific achievement that, for a time, provide model problems and solutions to a community of scientific practitioners. He says that on page 3 of his book. And so a paradigm for a scientist is a particular way of thinking about scientific problems that provides the theoretical basis for all scientific research. And just like a practitioner of any other field, whether you're a theologian or a historian or a political science major or an engineer, you have to have a worldview or a way that you look at the data, a set of ideas and beliefs that is going to drive your research, and a system of controls that will determine the kind of outcomes that you might generate with your research. And Kuhn is going to argue that science is no different. So scientists operate within these paradigms, which are these models that they use to conduct research, and in a lot of ways this helps scientists anticipate the kind of conclusions that will be drawn from their research. So paradigms create what Thomas Kuhn calls the research of normal science. And so for Thomas Kuhn, this is the work that scientists do on a normal basis. And Kuhn outlines that there are 3 components of normal scientific work that are determined by the paradigm of the scientist. The first is that paradigms help determine the significant facts. So when a scientist does an experiment, what is he going to be looking for as a result of his work? What are the facts that he has to operate with, or she has to operate with? And then the second part of this is to match the facts with the theory of the paradigm, because in reality, all that a scientific paradigm is a theory about the way that specific phenomenon in nature relate to each other. And so you have to determine the facts, you have to match these facts with the paradigm, and then third, you have to articulate or refine your theory through the data that you generate from these experiments. And this is the kind of work that scientists do on a day-to-day basis. And again, Thomas Kuhn was a major philosopher of science, and I think he wrote a couple of other books on the philosophy of science, but he was for a while a practicing scientist too. So Thomas Kuhn knows the issues inside and out from both a practical scientific point of view and from a more philosophical, epistemological kind of view as well. And he's just trying to explain what it is that scientists are doing when they go to work every single day. And so they're working out of these paradigms. These paradigms control normal research, and they kind of help the scientist articulate or interpret the facts, the data that they generate from the experiments that they run. And the point that Thomas Kuhn makes is that paradigms control the direction of scientific research. So paradigms are very useful to help give a scientist some sort of direction when they're conducting their research. And it sets expectations about the conclusions that will be drawn from research. So the data that is generated from a scientific experiment is going to be fit into the prevailing theories of the paradigm. And so in a lot of ways, paradigms are similar to creeds, which we talked about a few weeks back. We discussed on the show how creeds are not necessarily a bad thing. They kind of help define what a community is and what a community does, but the creed kind of determines what a community is going to believe and the conclusions that they're going to come to about their beliefs. And these paradigms work in the exact same way. So how do scientists grow and change? So obviously, we don't work with the same scientific paradigms in the 21st century as we did in the 18th century, and Thomas Kuhn is going to address that in his book. So Thomas Kuhn talks about how paradigms, these overarching ways, these overarching models that scientists use to conduct normal research, they break down when they fail to explain the data. So over time, the scientists are going to conduct research. This research will produce data, and that data will not be able to fit back into the paradigm that generated the scientific experiment in the first place. And so Thomas Kuhn calls this process anomaly. And the anomaly will eventually lead to the end of one paradigm and the replacement of that paradigm with another one. And now Thomas Kuhn talks a lot about how these paradigm shifts, is what he's going to call it, they cause a lot of controversy in the scientific community and can lead to bitter divisions, because there are always going to be scientists that are going to want to cling to a paradigm even when the evidence that is generated by that paradigm, the data that results from experiments that were conducted within that paradigm, do not support it. There are going to be scientists that are just going to cling to it. And so one of Kuhn's main points, and this is really getting to the heart of the structure of scientific revolution and kind of the heart of what I think that we as Protestant libertarians need to take away from this, is that one of Kuhn's most important points is that these paradigm shifts in science, when one paradigm is shown to be false based on the data and is replaced with another one, are extremely messy, and they often result in a completely new way of thinking about and performing scientific research. So paradigm shifts cause a lot of dislocations within the scientific community, and it often takes several years for one paradigm to die out and for a new paradigm to be completely embraced by the scientific community. And then he also makes the point in his book that scientists also are often refuse to reject their previously held scientific paradigm, even if the anomalies contradict the presuppositions upon which the paradigm rests. And for Thomas Kuhn, this demonstrates, and this is the most important point that I am going to make today, this demonstrates for Kuhn that scientists are no less subjective than everybody else, and that there is nothing that is particularly objective about science. And this is one of the flaws with the way that we have been taught to think about science since the Enlightenment. We think that scientists are kind of like these superhumans that are purely objective, that don't let any of their biases and preferences get in the way of their scientific research. They just kind of hover above the rest of us from an epistemological or intellectual point of view and just look at the data objectively. And so the illusion that this has created is that scientific consensus or that scientific conclusions don't have any flaws and were not formed by any sort of presuppositions or preconceptions. But Thomas Kuhn argues that this isn't the case, and it's the messiness of these paradigm changes. And he gives several examples of this in his book, of the way that scientists sometimes violently cling to a paradigm that dominated their way of thinking about the science, even when other scientists have demonstrated using empirical evidence that that paradigm was false. And again, over and over again, Kuhn's going to make the point that scientists are subjective. They're just normal human beings, and there's nothing more objective about the scientific process than any other academic discipline. It's no different, philosophically speaking, in terms of objectivity than history or philosophy or theology or the written languages. all of that is the truth. These scientists are just as subjective as the rest of us. Now, he goes on to explain how the myth of the objective scientist develops. Scientific textbooks often present, according to Thomas Kuhn, scientific discoveries as a smooth, progressive process towards a greater degree of truth. But Thomas Kuhn argues, and he has an entire section on this in this book, he argues that this process of making it look as if science is smooth and constantly progressing towards more and more truth masks the fact that scientific revolutions are extremely messy and don't always lead to a greater degree of understanding. Sometimes anomalies come up, according to Kuhn, and they demolish a previously held paradigm, but then the new paradigm that is embraced by the scientific community is just as flawed as the one that it replaces. And scientific textbooks don't often account for that, which gives us, as the casual observers, this impression that from the Enlightenment on, science has been steadily moving forward in a more or less a linear, progressive sort of way. And one of the points that Thomas Kuhn makes here is that, yes, we have to abandon the myth that science is kind of always on this smooth uphill progress, and we also have to abandon the myth that scientists are somehow objective and that the results of scientific studies are somehow objective, that they're not influenced by the biases of the scientists at all. And Thomas Kuhn would say this isn't to denigrate science. Like, Thomas Kuhn is not a skeptic about science. Thomas Kuhn is extremely positive and optimistic about what the scientific enterprise can accomplish, as am I, and as are, I think, most people in the Western world now. He only wants to make the point that there are limits, and there are extreme limits to what science does, what science is capable of doing, and what science can realistically accomplish. And, you know, again, as I go back to this myth that was generated by Enlightenment scientists, that at some point science would be able to explain absolutely everything that takes place in human nature, and Thomas Kuhn just doesn't think that that's realistic. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that scientists are just as subjective as the rest of us. There's nothing epistemologically or intellectually special about scientists that make them any less subjective than the people that you see giving you the news on TV every day. This is going to lead us to the last kind of great concluding truth of Thomas Kuhn's book here, where Thomas Kuhn is going to talk about the degree to which science produces truth. Because this was another lie, I think, that was told to us by everyone in the media and most of the people in the government during the COVID pandemic, is that somehow the results of the scientific work is necessarily 100% true. That was kind of the way that they conceptualized it. But Thomas Kuhn is going to challenge that, and he says this. This is so beautiful. I love what he says here, and this is incredibly important. So starts on page 169 in the Structures of Scientific Revolution. He says, "It is now time to notice that until the last very few pages, the term truth has entered this essay only in a quotation from Francis Bacon." Francis Bacon, of course, very famously created the scientific method. "And even in those pages, it entered only as a source for the scientist's conviction that incompatible rules for doing science cannot coexist except during revolutions when the profession's main task is to eliminate all sets but one. The developmental process described in this essay has been a process of evolution from primitive beginnings, a process whose successive stages are characterized by an increasingly detailed and refined understanding of nature. But nothing that has been or will be said makes it a process of evolution towards anything. Inevitably, that lacuna will have disturbed many readers. We are all deeply accustomed to seeing science as the one enterprise that draws constantly nearer to some goal set by nature in advance." So Thomas Kuhn here is going to say that there is real progress in science. When scientists do research, we do learn. But what we're moving from is a state of primitivity where we don't know things to a greater and greater degree of precision, a greater and greater degree of understanding. But that doesn't necessarily mean that science is always going to arrive at the absolute truth, that we're not going to wake up one morning in a world where the scientists have figured absolutely everything out and we don't have to do any more scientific research. He's going to go on. He says, "Does there need to be any such goal of having, kind of this perfect understanding of the truth through science? Can we not account for both science's existence and its success in terms of evolution from the community state of knowledge at any given time? phenomenon, does it really help to imagine that there is some one full, objective, true account of nature, and that the proper measure of the scientific achievement is the extent to which it brings us closer to that ultimate goal? If we can learn to substitute evolution from what we do know for evolution towards what we wish to know, a number of vexing problems may vanish in the process. Somewhere in this maze, for example, he's going to say must lie the problem of induction. Beautifully, beautifully written there. And again, to reiterate, his idea is that science progresses from primitivity, but not necessarily towards truth. Science is really, really good at producing data. It's really, really good at challenging assumptions and at figuring out what's false, and it can give us a better understanding of the natural world. That is what science is designed to do, and science has been, it's impossible to deny that the scientific enterprise has been incredibly effective, but science produces data. This data, while it gives us a better understanding of phenomenon which take place in the natural world, that data still has to be interpreted and fit into pre-existing paradigms. And as Thomas Kuhn says, a lot of the time scientists will cling so fervently to their scientific paradigm that they can't give it up, even when those paradigms are proven empirically to be false by scientific research here. So based on Kuhn's work, I try to lay down a definition for how I'm going to use terms on this podcast. And I think that I have a good definition of science, and this is one that corresponds to some other scientific literature I've read. And this is, I think, kind of the definition that Kuhn arrives at as well. So our definition of science on this show is this: science is a method that allows us to analyze and explain phenomenon that take place in the natural world. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it's really important, and there are a lot of things that we are going to need to draw out of this when we begin to talk about kind of the political and the theological problems of science. Science is a method that allows us to analyze and explain phenomenon that take place in the natural world. There are a lot of benefits to that definition there. The first one is that it avoids a metaphysical commitment to some kind of final goal of science. And again, the justification for a lot of the government overreach during the pandemic was that the scientists were coming up with greater and greater truths about COVID every single day. And eventually, if we just listened to the science, we'd be able to get through this, that the scientists were going to figure everything out about COVID and also tell us the proper response that we should have to avoid getting it. And that's just not true. Science can't do that. There is no final goal in scientific research. And again, the next kind of corollary to this definition is that the analysis of nature using the scientific method does produce data. Again, like scientists produce hard empirical evidence when they do scientific research. But the problem with that evidence is that that evidence itself has to be interpreted and fit into an explanation of the phenomenon being studied. And as we have seen, oftentimes scientists will use that data to explain pre-existing paradigms, even if that data seems to go against the grain of the paradigm. So in this way, science is really no different than archaeology. Archaeology is just the hard or the physical study of history. You can go over to the Middle East and dig a bunch of artifacts out of the dirt. You have hard evidence in front of you, evidence that you can see and touch, and all of that. But you still have to fit that hard evidence into some sort of overall explanation as to why that piece of archaeological that piece of archaeological work that you've dug out of the dirt, how does that fit into your overall understanding of whatever historical problem you're trying to study? There's no difference there. We have hard evidence, and it has to be interpreted into a larger explanatory whole. Scientists are absolutely no better at doing that than the rest of us. And Thomas Kuhn argues and suggests here that sometimes scientists that neglect philosophy are actually worse at interpreting that data, at least into some sort of overarching scheme, than the rest of us. And so really, when we think about science, what counts as scientific is the collection of data using the scientific method. Again, the work of science is to analyze the natural world, things that we can clearly observe, phenomenon that take place place in nature. That gives us the ability to collect data about what we see. The scientific method is the best method that we have that enables us to do that. But what counts as scientific is the collection of data using the scientific method, not the interpretation of the data by subjective scientists. Again, the only thing objective about science is the data that is generated from studies. The interpretation of that data that always comes after the studies is incredibly subjective. And that's the reason why the science on all kinds of issues is constantly changing. It's because scientists realize that the old paradigms that they were working with that generated data, they don't quite match the evidence that they're getting from the research that they are conducting. Now, I think for those of you guys that have been paying attention, you're probably already starting to see where I'm going with this analysis of Kuhn's work in the structure of scientific revolution. There's just so many conclusions that we can obviously draw from in his work. Now, I didn't read this book until really, I think it was last fall, so we're talking like late 2021. But when I read Kuhn's book, it made a lot of the conversations about science during the pandemic and scientists in particular make a lot more sense. And so some of you guys are probably already anticipating the direction that this conversation is headed. But there are a couple of applications that I want to make based on Kuhn's work regarding the way in which we discuss politics and the science behind politics in this country. So the first application that I want to make is from another great book called The Postmodern Condition, which was written by one of the leading postmodern philosophers, Jean-Francois Lyotard, in 1979. And Lyotard is one of the first philosophers to try to define postmodernism. And what he does very early in this book is he defines postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. And I think one of the reasons why people are put off by postmodernist philosophy and why it kind of unfairly gets associated with critical theory is that postmodernists oftentimes use this incredibly difficult language when they could find much more simple ways of explaining their ideas to normal people like me. But basically what he means when he says that postmodernism is an incredulity towards meta-narratives, that just means that postmodernism is a way of being skeptical about any sort of idea that tries to explain absolutely everything. And one of the problems with modernism, with the worldview that was generated by the Enlightenment, is that the thinkers of the Enlightenment and the thinkers of the post-Enlightenment period, what we call the modern world, all believed that knowledge was objective and that if we used science and if we used reason, we could eventually come up with a purely objective understanding of absolutely everything. And the goal was that one day human beings would be able to explain everything that happened in nature and everything that happened metaphysically as well using their reason. And postmodernism is a skepticism towards that kind of objective view of knowledge, that people are going to be able to explain absolutely everything. And so one of the things that Lyotard picks up on in this book is that he's going to spend a lot of the postmodern condition criticizing the way that science is passed off as a meta-narrative in popular discourse, while that interpretation of science as a meta-narrative relies entirely on non-scientific assumptions. In other words, what Lyotard is going to say is that science has created this mythology for itself, that it is objective and that it is leading us as a human species to the absolute truth one day, but that claim in and of itself is not scientific. The claim that science is objective does not rely on any sort of hard scientific empirical evidence. And so he says this right here on page 29 in the Postmodern Condition. He says that scientific knowledge cannot know and make known that it is the true knowledge without resorting to the other narrative kind of knowledge, which from its point of view is no knowledge at all. So again, science tries to criticize other ways of generating knowledge by saying, science is the objective, the empirical way to generate truth. Every other way of thinking about reality is necessarily flawed or has to be subordinate to science. But that assumption itself is anti-scientific. That is the point that Lyotard makes, and he grapples with this for most of this book. And so then he talks about the problem with politics as a sort of a science. And he says this here on page 30 and 31. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from Lyotard here. He says, this way of inquiring into socio-political legitimacy. In other words, he's talking about how states often use the language of science to justify their political policies. So this way of inquiring into socio-political legitimacy combines with the new scientific attitude. The name of the hero is the people. The sign of legitimacy is the people's consensus, and their mode of creating norms is deliberation. The notion of progress is a necessary outgrowth of this. It represents nothing other than the movement by which knowledge is presumed to accumulate. But this movement is extended to the new socio-political subject. The people debate among themselves about what is just or unjust in the same way that the scientific community debates about what is true or false. They accumulate civil laws just as scientists accumulate scientific laws. They perfect their rules of consensus just as the scientists produce new paradigms to revise their rules in light of what they have learned. And then he says this, and this is really, really important here too, especially for people that want to associate postmodernism with the left. He says on page 31 here that the question of the state, the question of government, then becomes intimately entwined with that of scientific knowledge. It's also clear that this interlocking is many-sided. The people, the nation, or even humanity, and especially their political institutions, are not just content to know, they legislate. That is, they formulate prescriptions that have the status of norms. And so again, he is going to say that the fact that we have allowed the language of science to kind of infiltrate the way we do politics, we think that somehow science is objective, and so if we do politics and we do society in an objective way, we are going to lead everyone to this greater and greater degree of truth. Lyotard is admitting there kind of flat out that this is exactly how the state is able to generate laws that are sometimes oppressive. And I think Lyotard is very skeptical, as a lot of postmodernists are, of the state. This is why I think for libertarians, reading people like Foucault, reading people like Lyotard, reading people like Kuhn, this is going to be incredibly helpful when it allows us to think about the way that the state kind of propagates these narratives about themselves, the way that the state propagandizes itself in order to pass itself off as legitimate. Murray Rothbard, the great libertarian philosopher, has a little section on this in his classic essay, The Anatomy of the State. Now, we're going to do a couple of weeks on Anatomy of the State here, I think, maybe 4 or 5 episodes down the road from now. But I want to put a marker down here because Murray Rothbard highlights the exact same problems that Lyotard and then behind Lyotard, Kuhn highlights in their work. And he talks about how the state has appropriated science for legitimacy as well. And so I'm going to read what Murray Rothbard says here. He says, in the present more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by the invocation of a new god, science. State rule is now proclaimed as being ultra-scientific, as constituting planning by experts. But while reason is invoked more than in previous centuries, this is not the true reason of the individual and his exercise of free will. It is still collectivist and determinist, still implying holistic aggregates and coercive manipulation of passive subjects by their rulers. The increasing use, Rothbard will say, of scientific jargon has permitted the state's intellectuals to weave obscurantist apologia for state rule that would have only met with derision by the populace of a simpler age. A robber who justified his theft by saying that he really helped his victims by his spending giving a boost to retail trade would find new converts, but when this theory is clothed, would find few converts, but when this theory is clothed in Keynesian equations and impressive references to the multiplier effect, it unfortunately carries more conviction. And so the assault on common sense proceeds, each age performing the task in its own way. Again, along with Lyotard there, and there are not a lot of people out there that are going to compare Rothbard to Lyotard, but I'm going to do it right now. Along with Lyotard, Rothbard understands that the state can pass itself off as scientific. Again, we all believe that science is objective, even though Thomas Kuhn has proved that science is not. It produces data about the natural world that has to be interpreted, and that the scientists that are doing the interpretation are no less objective than the rest of us. But when the state picks up this meta-narrative about science being this objective field, This is the way that the state can legitimize itself. And this was nowhere more obvious than during COVID. I mean, we were told by everybody that we had to trust the science. I mean, over and over again. It was disgusting. And even really intelligent people that I love and respect believed, because the state just said it over and over again and the media said it over and over again, that if you did not support the predominant mainstream narrative about COVID, that you were obviously anti-science. That was the corollary that they came to. Again, the state told us over and over again that all of the restrictions, the lockdowns, the social distancing, the masking up in schools, the shutting down of businesses, the fact that everyone needed to get the vaccine, that it would prevent you from getting COVID, that the unvaccinated were the problem. All of that stuff was pushed in the name of science, using the idea that we have given to science in our society that it is somehow objective. But we've seen that the state and all of the intellectuals that supported the state in the mainstream media were wrong. Like, we know at the end of the pandemic that they were wrong about almost all of this. And we're just starting to see now that the damage caused by all of these state interventions might have been worse than anything that COVID could have done to us from the beginning. And then it also begs the question as to why the state deliberately tried to censor doctors like Jay Bhattacharya and like Patrick Maloney, I think is his name. I really can't remember what that guy's name was, and other scientists who were very vocal, not in saying that COVID was a myth or that COVID wasn't real, but just in questioning the official narrative about the pandemic. And I just want to say this here on the podcast, there was absolutely nothing scientific, using the definition that we have provided on this show about science, about the way that the government and the mainstream media and the medical industrial complex approach the pandemic. There was nothing scientific about that at all. Had it been scientific, they would have allowed alternate interpretations of the data to be fairly presented to everyone in the public, but instead, the government, the mainstream media, the social media institutions, all of them did everything that they could to restrict us from getting good information about COVID, from getting alternative points of views on the pandemic, on the vaccines, on all of those things. And again, I think that the COVID deniers are crazy. I agree. But again, there were plenty of people out there that were just trying to say, hey, maybe this government overreach isn't justified by the data. And those people were consistently shot down until quietly sometime around March, the Biden administration decided that the pandemic wasn't a priority and it was all swept under the rug. And again, all of this was done in the name of objective science, which Kuhn proves, demonstrates, and the structures of scientific revolution is not true to science. And again, one of the points that Lyotard and Rothbard, or one of the corollaries to the points that Lyotard and Rothbard makes, is that understanding of science can easily apply to all aspects of state planning, not just with respect to COVID. Again, people use scientific language to justify the military-industrial complex and our 20 years of war in the Middle East. They use it to justify economic confiscation, the welfare state, Social Security, the Federal Reserve. All of these institutions and all of these programs invoke the name of science because they know that science has kind of this capital of legitimacy in our society. People think that if you attribute the name of science to something, that it has to be true. Again, there's kind of this philosophical equation in our society between science and truth, but none of that is true. And I think as libertarians, we need to take Kuhn's arguments and then Lyotard and Rothbard's arguments seriously when we have to learn to disconnect the idea of science, which again is incredible. There's no denying that the world we live in is a much better place than the world of the 17th century, and that is in large part because of what science has accomplished, what the scientific method has accomplished. But there are limits to it. It's not objective, and it will never ever get us to the absolute truth. It will never ever take us all the way there. Now, this is going to lead me into the theological problem of science, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a really long time. Now, as I said at the beginning of the show, ever since the Enlightenment, science, which again has been equated with hard truth, absolute truth, has been seen as a threat to religion, as if science and religion cannot occupy the same intellectual domain. But if the entire purpose of science, its one and only purpose, is to analyze the natural world, and if that conception of science stems from the 17th century, is it really appropriate to criticize the writers of the Bible for not being post-Enlightenment scientific thinkers? And here's the other thing that goes along with that. Isn't it inappropriate for us as Christians to expect that the Bible should give us scientific information? I mean, again, if all that science is a method that allows us to explore and explain phenomenon that occur in nature, it's a method of exploring the natural world, and it produces data, and that data has to be interpreted into a larger whole. But as I said before, modern science is a product of the 17th century, and this isn't to say that the ancients didn't think about some of these issues. They definitely did, but science, as we know it today, is a complete product of the 17th century. So in what way is it fair for us to expect the Bible to give us scientific information, in the sense that it's giving us kind of objective information about the natural world? And this is the point that I want to make here. I do not think that the Bible is threatened in any way, and I don't think that the gospel is threatened. I don't think that Christianity is threatened in any way by science at all, because again, none of the writers of the Bible, they were all born before the scientific revolution of the 17th century. All of the writers of the Bible were not living in a world that was shaped by modern science. And so when the writers of the Bible talk about the natural world, they're not trying to answer scientific questions. They're not trying to come up with hard data about why things work the way they do in the natural world. Instead, I think they're actually doing something much, much bigger. When the writers of the Bible, and you can look at this in the Psalms, this is actually all the Psalms are a great example of this. The writers of the Bible, when they talk about the natural world, are trying to talk about the meaning and the purpose of the world that God created. Again, they're not attempting to provide us with a scientific analysis of creation. They're saying, look, God has created this good world. What does it all mean? And if we're going to take Thomas Kuhn seriously, and if we're going to take Lyotard and Rothbard seriously, then we have to understand that science is not equipped to answer those kinds of questions, that the writers of the Bible are concerned with the purpose of creation. What is creation here for? What are human beings all about? Why did God create the world? What's the meaning behind all of that? That is the kind of information that we get from the writers of the Bible when they speak of the natural world. We don't get scientific information because they weren't trying to answer scientific questions that weren't even asked until the 17th century. We shouldn't expect them to ask those questions, and when we read and interpret parts of the Bible that talk explicitly about the natural world, we should not interpret them with the expectation that they're somehow flawed or wrong if they don't come to modern scientific conclusions. That's not the purpose there. And so with that in mind, the entire debate between religion and science is built on a massive set of flawed assumptions on both sides of the argument, because again, since the Enlightenment, Christians have more or less embraced the Enlightenment definition of science as leading us closer and closer and closer to all truths about the natural world. And Christians have said, well, if that's the case, then the Bible has to give us information about modern science. But that's to give up what the Bible is doing for the sake of embracing modernity. These two things are just on separate tracks. Like as I've said before, science is there to produce information about the natural world to help us better understand how nature works in a physical way. All of the writings in the Bible that deal with creation are trying to explain the purpose of it. What is God doing with this, and what is the place of humanity within God's good creation? Now, I grew up actually, I live about 10 miles away from it now, 15 miles away from it now, but I grew up about 2 miles down the road from where the Creation Museum is in Petersburg, Kentucky. And those of you guys that pay attention to kind of a lot of popular theological discourse in society know that the Creation Museum is the only museum in the world that is dedicated to presenting the stories in the Bible as being literally true, scientifically true. And so the Creation Museum says that Genesis in Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation stories in Genesis are designed, they explicitly say that they're designed to give us scientific information, but that's just not true. Now, we're going to address Genesis in full in future episodes, but the purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 is to explain how God's creation is good and also why humans are supposed to be responsible for God's creation. Genesis does not answer or address modern scientific questions. Therefore, we can't use it to answer questions about how nature works, and it can't be criticized by modern scientists for not answering those questions because, again, that wasn't the intellectual world that the writers of the Bible were operating in. It doesn't answer or address modern scientific questions, and that's okay. Science cannot give us answer to those metaphysical questions about why we're here and about why God created the world, just as the Bible is not designed to give us information about the laws of the universe, which we didn't discover until the 17th century. And I think by trying to force the Bible to answer questions that the writers of the Bible were not asking, we miss what the Bible is actually attempting to tell us in the name of trying to fit the Bible into this objective understanding of science. Well, guys, there was a lot there today. I'm going to highly encourage you, if you're interested in philosophy at all, please pick up a copy of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is going to give you a great way, if you are a libertarian, to process and think about how the government responded to COVID and about the failures of our society to adequately critique the way that we have discussed science and used science over the last 2 years. And if you're a Protestant or a Christian in general, this will, I hope, help you to better understand the way in which science is often used unfairly to criticize religion. They're not competing for the same intellectual domain. The Bible is trying to do something different than what science is doing for us. As always, if you have questions for me, please feel free to email me or follow me. We're on Twitter now at Pro Liberty Pod, so check me out there. Thank you guys so much for giving me reviews and ratings on all the podcast apps. That really does help me get some more exposure. Again, if you want to follow me on Twitter, that will be helpful as well. You can follow me on Twitter now at Pro Liberty Pod. And please consider doing that. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you all next week. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.